My name is Meredith Blake, and the day my son destroyed me was supposed to be my birthday. 72 years. That's how long I'd walked this earth. I wasn't asking for a parade, just a quiet dinner. Maybe flowers. Maybe a card with his handwriting. Something real. Something from the heart. But instead I got nothing. No knock at the door. No call. No text. What I did get was an overdraft notice from my bank sent via email at 3:17 p.m. just as I was slicing a small dry lemon cake I had bought for myself at the grocery store. My balance, 1834. No savings. No retirement cushion. No emergency fund. Nothing. I stared at that number for what felt like hours, though the cake had already started to harden in the warm kitchen air. I hadn't lit the candle yet. One single candle, that's all I'd planned to use. I figured, what's the point in putting up 72? But that day, that number meant everything. Because it was the exact number of years it took for me to be stripped of everything I had ever saved. And the thief? The boy I gave birth to. Daniel. It didn't happen all at once. Of course it didn't. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't barge in. It knocks gently. Smiles. Hugs you first. Then reaches into your chest and pulls out the parts of you that trusted. Daniel had been distant lately, but he always blamed work stress. He never mentioned gaming, or crypto, or the guilds and NFT quests and the god-awful online casinos he would soon drown in. But the first red flag had come weeks before. If only I'd seen it. Mom, he'd texted. Can I borrow $2,000 just for a week? I had an unexpected bill. I'll Venmo you back Friday. It was a weekday night. I remember I was watching reruns of Jeopardy! With my cat on my lap. I sent the money immediately. No questions asked. Of course I did. That was my first mistake. The second came a few days later. Actually, can you do $3,000? Something went wrong. But it's temporary, I promise. Then, my card's frozen. PayPal's being weird. My account's under review. There was a bug in the system. The lies came coded in digital language I barely understood. But what I did understand was this: Daniel was scared. Or so it seemed. And when your child sounds scared, your heart doesn't ask for receipts. You help. Even if it's the third time. Even if it's the fifth. Even if it means you dip into the savings account you built since 1982, the one marked Mom's nest egg in my old-fashioned ledger. I'd always liked writing things down, even after moving to online banking. That's how I tracked it all. Every deposit, every transfer, every dollar. Until the numbers stopped making sense. 3 days before my birthday, I sent Daniel the last amount I could access without penalty. $16,000 from a fixed-term deposit. I broke it early. Lost hundreds in fees. He didn't even say thank you. No, actually, he said, "You're lucky I told you." Most people my age wouldn't even ask. They'd just find a way. That sentence? It should have shattered me right then. But I was still clinging to hope, this illusion that Daniel was just in a phase. That he'd wake up. That the old Daniel, the boy who used to run home with drawings from my refrigerator, was still in there. That hope made me blind. So when I stood in my tiny kitchen on the day I turned 72, slicing a lonely cake with plastic wrap still clinging to the edges, I still believed he'd show up. Even when it was 6 p.m., even when the sun began to dip behind the fence outside, even when the email from my bank said politely that I had less than $20 to my name. I called him, not because I was angry, but because I was scared. "Daniel," I said softly, "I got an alert." "Did something happen to the funds?" His voice was cold, flat. He sounded like he was chewing something. "You're still checking your balance," he said with a dry laugh. "God, you really are that kind of mom." "What kind?" I asked. "The kind who gives money and expects love back," he snapped. I didn't know what to say. He hung up. That was my birthday present. I didn't cry that night. Instead, I sat in silence, staring at the ledger I had written in for 40 years. There was a single line where I had once marked future trip. Italy. I ran my fingers over it slowly. Then, for the first time in my life, I turned the page backwards. I began rereading everything. Every entry, every date, every memo that said transfer to Daniel, and something began to shift inside me. A ledger is a record, a history, and mine didn't just tell me what I'd lost. It told me who took it. I slept in the armchair that night. Not because I couldn't make it to bed, but because I didn't want to. I sat with a ledger on my lap like a ghost story I couldn't put down. The numbers stared back at me, cold and indifferent. But in their silence, they whispered something I hadn't heard in a long time. You are not crazy. You are not the one who lied. You are not the one who failed. You are the one who trusted. That morning, I didn't brush my hair. I didn't warm up my tea. I didn't even change out of my nightgown. I just sat there staring at the paper trail that Daniel had left behind. Line after line of perfectly documented theft. But you see, when it happens in slow motion, you don't feel the crash until you're already bleeding. I remembered when Daniel was young how obsessed he'd become with small things. First, it was Lego sets he'd cry if he couldn't find a single piece. Then it was trading cards. Then it was online fantasy games. Always something to escape into, to lose himself in. At the time, I thought it was harmless. He was a quiet child. Sweet. A little too sweet. Maybe never rebellious. Never loud. Always eager to please, but only if it helped him get something. His father used to say he's smart, Mer. Too smart sometimes. But then his father died. Daniel was only 13. That year, he locked himself in his room for hours on end. I thought it was grief. Now I'm not so sure it wasn't the beginning of something else. I remembered the first time I gave him my debit card. He was 22, living at home after dropping out of college. He said he just needed it to order textbooks for an online course. He never gave me the receipts, but I didn't push. I told myself he's just trying to find his way. What I didn't know is that he was already gambling on online platforms disguised as strategy games. The kind with loot boxes. The kind with real money behind pretend dragons. I had assumed he was working. That the long hours he spent behind the computer screen were him building a freelance career like he'd claimed. But the more I thought about it, the more I remembered things that didn't line up. The brand new gaming chair that showed up as a gift from a friend. The 6 monitors he said were sponsored by his network. The Amazon packages that arrived daily, none of which I was allowed to open. The door always locked. The sudden mood swings. I thought maybe it was just anxiety. Maybe depression. I tiptoed around him the way a woman tiptoes around a man who might break. But I was the one who broke first. That morning, after my birthday, I made a list, not of what he had taken, but of every moment I had ignored. I wrote down $2,000 for the first emergency, $3,000 the following week, $500 when he said he needed one last big push to pay off a loan, $16,000 from the retirement account, $7,000 wire transfer labeled investment opportunity, and then I wrote down what I didn't have anymore. My medical savings, my travel dreams, my peace, all gone. I tried to call him again. I wanted an explanation, a conversation, some flicker of remorse. He answered on the second ring, voice groggy and annoyed. What now, Mom? I want to know where it went, Daniel, I said. All of it. You mean the money? He said, laughing bitterly. What do you want a refund? I want the truth. The truth. His tone turned icy. The truth is, you never supported what I actually cared about. So yeah, I took it. I used it. And I don't regret it. You wouldn't understand how real this is. This isn't a game. It's a future. It's community. It's ownership. I was silent. And you, he continued, you're just a boomer with a savings account. That money was just rotting there. My hand trembled as I held the phone. Daniel, that was my life, my security, my home. You still have the house, don't you? Be grateful. And then, just like that, he hung up. I sat there in shock. There's a particular pain that only mothers feel, a betrayal that slices deeper because it's so intimate, so personal. I had not just lost money. I had lost the version of my son that still called me mama when he had nightmares. And yet even then, a small voice inside whispered, this isn't over. Not yet. That night, I logged into my email and started searching for clues. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe transaction receipts? Maybe subscription notifications? But something in me had shifted. I wasn't going to cry anymore. I was going to trace the monster he'd become. Email after email, I discovered things. Subscriptions to online poker sites, cryptocurrency wallets, a receipt for a rare NFT dragon worth over $10,000, a forum post under a username I recognized, Demythic. I clicked it. There he was. bragging about finessing funds from an old boomer to buy meta skins. He even joked, "She doesn't even know what ETH is?" LOL. My son had mocked me publicly, and the internet, that vast ocean of anonymity, had clapped. But he had left a trail, and I was going to follow it. The name D Mythic became my obsession. I wrote it down in capital letters at the top of a fresh notebook page and circled it 3 times. Not with rage, but with precision. For the first time in weeks, I felt like Meredith Blake again. Not someone's mother, not someone's victim, but someone who knew how to read numbers, patterns, motives. That was my old job, after all. For over 30 years, I'd worked as an accountant. Small office, 3 co-workers, paper ledgers before the digital wave hit. We didn't deal in big sums or corporate mergers, but we were good at following trails. I hadn't touched that part of my brain in years, but now it lit up like a crime scene spotlight. The online forum was a treasure trove. I lurked for hours under a fake username, scrolling through posts from gamers and crypto traders. Most of them were just kids or people pretending not to be adults. They had their own language abbreviations, even a hierarchy based on who had the most skins tokens or online status. And among them, my son was a kind of king. Scam 25K from a family investor, LOA. Boomers fall for it every time. Still got my nest egg dragon worth it. I read these comments with a hollow chest. It wasn't just the money anymore. It was the glee. The entitlement. My son had built a digital throne from the bones of my retirement. But that wasn't even the worst of it. One user replied to Daniel's post with a laughing emoji and this comment, "Tell her to take it up with support." Oh, wait! She doesn't even know what a wallet is. That was when I realized. Daniel didn't think I could fight back. He thought I was just an old woman with a ledger and a cat. The next morning, I went to the community center. It's an old brick building on Elm Street, the kind of place where retirees take watercolor classes and arthritis yoga. But once a week, they also hosted a group called Silver Shield, a support circle for elderly people who had been victims of online fraud. I'd seen the flyer months ago and never thought I'd need it. Now I held it like a lifeline. There were 6 people in the room that day, mostly women. One man who sat with his arms folded, eyes on the floor. They looked like me, tired but trying. The moderator, a woman named Clarissa, welcomed me with the gentleness of someone who'd seen too many broken hearts. "Would you like to share?" she asked after the introductions. I nodded barely. "My name is Meredith," I said softly, "and my son stole my savings. For games, for coins I can't touch, for dragons that don't exist." No one laughed. They just nodded. Slowly, silently. One woman touched my hand. Clarissa spoke next. "You're not alone, and you're not powerless. The key is to stop thinking like a victim. Start thinking like an investigator." Those words echoed in me for days. With the help of Silver Shield, I began learning things I never thought I'd need to know at 72. How to trace Ethereum transactions using blockchain explorers. How to spot transaction IDs and link wallet addresses. How to file reports with platforms that host suspicious activity. How to screenshot, timestamp, and document every single piece of evidence. How to recognize the difference between crypto hot wallets and cold ones. I even created a fake profile on the same forum Daniel used. Not to engage, just to watch. Every time he posted, I archived it. Every time he transferred a digital asset, I traced it through blockchain logs. Clarissa helped me read. Every time he bragged, I wrote it down. My notebook began to fill with arrows, red circles, and printed screenshots. Not rage, just data, just patterns. It was like building a case file against someone I used to rock to sleep. One night, I stayed up until 2:00 a.m. I had discovered a link. Daniel had used the same email to register his gaming handle that he used for his PayPal recovery. Rookie mistake. That connected all of it. The crypto wallet, the casino platforms, the Steam purchases, the monthly withdrawals. And finally, it connected to a bank account in his name. He'd funneled over $48,000 from my accounts into his. All of it traceable. Clarissa clapped when I showed her the file. "You have enough to make noise," she said. "I don't want noise," I replied. "I want truth." She smiled. "Then it's time to go public." The suggestion startled me. Public, as in posted online. "Yes," Clarissa said. He used the internet to strip your dignity. Maybe the internet should return it. But he's my son. Then let him decide what that still means. I didn't answer. But that night, I stared at the empty cake box I still hadn't thrown away. And I imagined lighting that single candle. Not for a wish, but for a reckoning. It took me 3 more days to decide. Not because I was unsure of the evidence by now, it was airtight. Not because I was scared of what Daniel would say. He'd already said everything that could break me. But because I needed to grieve, not the money, the relationship. I sat on the porch in the early hours before dawn, clutching my old ceramic mug with the faded floral print. The cat rubbed against my ankles, sensing something in the air, change maybe. I whispered into the cold morning, "He's still my son." But I knew that wasn't the question anymore. The real question was, am I still his mother? Because a mother protects, a mother provides, a mother forgives. But I had done all 3, and still he had erased me. So now it was my turn. The video was Clarissa's idea. "It doesn't have to be a viral spectacle," she said. "It just has to be real." So we recorded it in her living room, using her iPhone propped up on a stack of books. I sat in front of a plain beige wall, my voice steady but quiet. No drama, no accusations, just the facts. "Hello, my name is Meredith Blake. I'm 72 years old. I was a bookkeeper for over 3 decades, and I raised my only child after my husband died. A few months ago, that child, my son, used my trust to drain my savings for his online addictions. He used games and crypto and digital scams to empty everything I spent a lifetime building." I paused, letting the silence sit heavy. I don't want pity. I want awareness. Because if this can happen to me, someone who knows how to follow numbers, it can happen to anyone. Your mother, your grandmother, your neighbor. They're not weak. They're targeted. We didn't name him. Not directly. But we didn't have to. The usernames, the forum posts, the digital breadcrumbs were all there. Public, time-stamped, verifiable. Clarissa uploaded the video to a platform called Justice Stream, where whistleblowers and fraud victims shared their stories. She also shared it on Reddit under a group called Scams Exposed. Within hours, it began to spread. At first, it was quiet. A few comments. Some hearts. Then someone posted a link. "Is this about user D Mythic? This sounds exactly like him." Then, "I've seen that guy in a Discord server, always bragging about fleecing his boomer mom." "Wait, is this the same guy who bought the NFT yacht skin?" I thought he was kidding about that. Within 24 hours, the video had over 60,000 views. And then something incredible happened. The same digital world Daniel thought would protect him turned on him. People began posting receipts, archived forum comments, crypto wallet addresses, screenshots of chats where he openly discussed mining mom's funds. Someone even found a clip from a live stream where Daniel, half-drunk, said, "Who cares? She'll be dead in 10 years." That clip spread like wildfire. It was surreal watching strangers defend me. Complete strangers writing things like, "This is financial abuse. Elder abuse, actually. He needs to be held accountable. Publicly. Meredith, you're stronger than 99% of us. This is not just a story. This is a warning." She didn't raise a man. She raised a leech. But even more than the outrage, something else began to emerge. Stories. Other mothers, other grandfathers, niches, caregivers. People from across the globe sharing their own tales of financial betrayal. It was as if my voice had opened a dam. 3 days later, Daniel called. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. "You've humiliated me," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done to my reputation? This isn't how families solve problems. You ruined me." I played it twice, hands steady. Clarissa helped me forward the recording to the online fraud unit that was now investigating the case. It turns out that public attention does what quiet complaints can't. The bank reached out. The gaming platforms began freezing assets. A legal aid volunteer offered to help me file a civil suit. Suddenly, my name wasn't just Meredith Blake. It was Meredith Blake, case number 432 AF19. And Daniel. He wasn't the smart kid with a digital empire anymore. He was a public case of financial elder exploitation. But something inside me still ached. Because what happens when your child becomes your predator? Who do you become in return? I found myself back at my ledger one night, flipping through the pages not for numbers, but for signs of love. Doodles he once made in the margins. Happy Mother's Day. Notes slipped between the balances. There had been love. Once. But love doesn't excuse harm, and forgiveness doesn't require silence. So I wrote one last line in the ledger right beneath the final balance transfer. Closed. Not in anger, but in truth. A few days later, I received an email. It was from a grandmother in Michigan. She wrote, "I saw your video. My grandson is just starting to ask for money." I recognized the pattern. I didn't send it. You saved me. And suddenly the ache didn't feel so useless. The betrayal hadn't swallowed me whole. It had become a signal fire. 2 weeks after the video went viral, my front doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. No packages. No friends. I moved slowly, wary. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there. He looked thinner, gaunt in a way that only guilt or exposure can carve into someone's face. His hair was unwashed. His hoodie sagged around his shoulders like it no longer belonged to him. For a long second, we didn't say anything. Then he opened his mouth and said, "You didn't have to do that." I didn't respond. I stepped aside, not to invite him in, but to show him the way back to his car if that was all he came for. He stepped in anyway. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The same table where I once taught him how to count with M&Ms. The same table where 30 years ago his father's obituary sat between a pile of unpaid bills and a single plate of untouched toast. Now it was the table where he would face the ruins of our relationship. "I'm sorry," he said eventually. Not, "I'm sorry, I took your savings." Not, "I'm sorry I mocked you." Not, "I'm sorry, I let strangers laugh at your pain." Just, "I'm sorry." I watched him closely. Sorry for what? His eyes darted. He didn't answer. Instead, he launched into a speech. "I've been under a lot of pressure, Mom. The industry's changed. Everyone's online. Everyone's playing for keeps. I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was just trying to win." "Win what?" I asked. He looked up. "Everything. Respect. Money. A life." I stared at him for a long time. "I gave you those things," I said softly. "But you didn't want them the way they came through work, through patience. You wanted shortcuts. And when I became one, you didn't hesitate." He flinched. "I didn't think it would blow up like this," he mumbled. "I know," I said. "That's why it had to." Daniel tried to shift the conversation. He blamed the algorithms, the influencers, the games designed to be addictive. He said things like, "I never meant for it to go that far, and everyone else does it too. And you're the only one who's ever believed in me." But belief isn't a blank check, and motherhood isn't martyrdom. So I sat still, listening to the whirlwind of justifications until he finally ran out of words. When he was done, I stood and walked to the drawer beside the refrigerator. I pulled out a small envelope. Inside were printed screenshots, forum posts, transaction histories, his usernames, his bragging, his mockery, every breadcrumb he'd left behind. I placed it in front of him. "Meredith," he began. "I'm not doing this for revenge," I said. "I'm doing this because silence is how people like you survive." "Not anymore." He stared at the papers, speechless. "I want to make it right," he said after a long pause. I shook my head. "You can't, but you can do the right thing now." "What does that mean?" "It means returning what you can, cooperating with investigators, signing an agreement to never contact me again unless it's through counsel." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I'm your son, and I was your mother," I said. "But you buried that the day you chose digital dragons over my dignity." Tears filled his eyes. He didn't fight. He just folded his hands in his lap as if he were 7 years old again, waiting to be forgiven. But forgiveness isn't something I hand out like sugar packets anymore. It's something he'll have to earn with silence, compliance, and accountability. That night, I sat alone in the living room. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I turned on my old record player and let the vinyl hum a tune from the 70s. Something slow, something that reminded me of a world before everything had a screen. The phone buzzed once. A notification. Clarissa had forwarded me an article. "Crypto scammer exposed by mother in viral video. Case sparks national attention on elder fraud." Below the headline, My photo. That same beige wall. That same calm face. The comment section was divided as the internet always is. Some called me brave. Others called me cruel. But the ones that stayed with me were the ones that said, "This happened to my aunt. We thought she was just paranoid." I work in IT. 90% of these scams start with someone trusting family. She's not heartless. She's the future. We need more Merediths. I replied to one comment privately. A woman named Janine, whose son had just asked for a temporary crypto loan. I wrote, "Check the language, the urgency, the excuses. Then ask yourself, would he ever sell his PS5 to help you? If the answer is no, you already know." She responded, "Thank you. You saved me." And in that moment, I realized something Daniel never did. I had lost my money, but I hadn't lost my voice. 2 weeks later, Daniel's accounts were frozen. The platforms cooperated. The financial investigators reached out. And I handed over everything I had documented, neatly organized, stapled, and dated. Daniel never reached out again. He knew I meant it. I took one last look at the old ledger. At the very bottom of the final page I wrote, "Closure is not justice, but it's a place to rest." And then I turned off the light. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand marble columns, no echoing chambers like in the movies. Just beige walls, rows of stiff chairs, and a judge with a tired face that looked like she'd seen 100 family betrayals this year alone. I wore my best blouse, a simple navy button-up that used to be for special dinners. My hands were steady, my breath calm. I wasn't here to relive the pain. I was here to confirm the truth. Daniel sat 3 rows ahead, flanked by a weary public defender and a silence thicker than anything I'd ever heard come from him. He didn't look at me. That was new. For once, there were no smirks, no justifications, no confident shrug that screamed, "You don't understand the future." Because today the future had a name: restitution. The state had picked up the case under financial elder abuse laws. Turns out all those digital receipts and crypto trails I collected with Clarissa's help. They painted a story even a disinterested prosecutor couldn't ignore. There was no need for a dramatic trial, just facts. I sat on the witness bench, voice low, and even walking them through what happened. The initial transfers, the crypto wallets, the screenshots of Daniel's forum posts, the connection between his accounts and mine, the total amount, 74,380. Teeny. I thought it might feel like a scar reopened, but it didn't. It felt clean, sharp, necessary, like the cut that drains the infection. Daniel didn't contest most of the charges. He accepted a plea deal. Mandatory repayment plan, financial counseling, probation, and community service at a center for senior digital literacy. Poetic, I know. There was no jail time. Part of me had wanted it, but another part, a part still tethered to the boy I once raised, knew prison wouldn't undo what had already happened. What I really wanted was for him to face what he had done, not just to me but to himself. When the judge asked if I wanted to speak, I stood. I didn't prepare a speech, but the words came steady as if they'd lived inside me all along. I raised my son alone. I fed him when I couldn't feed myself. I gave him love when the world gave him nothing. And when he asked for my savings, I gave those too. Not because I was foolish, but because I believed in him. That belief was used as a weapon. I turned toward Daniel for the first time, but now I believe in something else. I believe in truth. I believe in consequences. And I believe that when someone shows you who they are, you don't close your eyes. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge looked down, lips pressed. I sat back down, and for the first time in months, I felt taller. After the ruling, I walked out of the courthouse and stood on the steps. The sky was bright unnaturally, so like it was trying too hard to cheer me up. Clarissa was waiting at the bottom. "Well," she asked. I exhaled slowly. "It's done. Justice." "Not quite, but enough." She nodded, then held out a small envelope. "What's this?" "A grant," she smiled. "From the Silver Shield Alliance. Small, but enough to help you start over." I opened it. Inside was a check for $5,000. I felt the sting behind my eyes, not from the money but from the kindness, from the proof that the world wasn't just full of users and thieves. Some people still showed up for each other. I used that grant to do something I never thought I would. I started teaching, not in a school, not in a classroom, but online. Digital Defense for Dignity was the name of the workshop I created with Clarissa's help. A free 5-week course for seniors covering everything from phishing emails to crypto red flags to how to say no, even to family. At first, only 3 people signed up, then 10, then 50. Then I stopped counting. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just protecting myself. I was building something that could protect others. One evening, after wrapping up a session on how to spot emergency transfer scams, I received an email. Subject line, "Thank you. You saved my mother's life." The sender explained how his aging mom had almost transferred $10,000 to a trusted grandson with a gaming startup. She'd seen my video, taken the course, paused, asked questions, and saved herself. I cried for the first time in weeks, not out of grief, but out of release, because I finally understood something. What Daniel stole was real, but what I rebuilt, that was mine. And it was stronger. Months passed. The headlines faded. The video stopped trending. But I didn't. I grew. I gardened again. I repainted the spare room. I reopened my passport folder. Italy still waited. And one morning I made a new ledger. The first line, Meredith Blake. Balance. More than enough. Fall arrived gently that year. The leaves turned amber and drifted like quiet applause outside my window. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the seasons changing. The world moved on, and so did I. Silver Shield had invited me to speak at their national gathering. "You're our story of resilience," Clarissa said. "Of silent strength turned into strategic survival." I wasn't used to that kind of language. Me, a retired bookkeeper who used to clip coupons and balance a checkbook with a mechanical pencil. But I accepted. The conference hall was modest, folding chairs and a simple podium. But the room was full. Seniors in cardigans and glasses, younger folks sitting beside them, notebooks open, children of the betrayed, siblings of the manipulated, and survivors like me. I told my story, again. But this time it wasn't about the betrayal. It was about the rebuilding. I spoke of the cold kitchen on my 72nd birthday, of the digital dragons, of the single candle I never lit, of how knowledge, not rage, had become my sword, and how I had turned the very internet that broke me into a shield. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone began to clap, then another. Then the whole room stood, not because I was extraordinary, but because I was familiar. They saw themselves in me. And for many, that was enough to start fighting back. Afterward, a woman approached me. Her name was Belinda, 84. Thick glasses, frail arms. She reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a Western Union receipt for $4,900. "He said it was for a medical emergency," she whispered. "My grandson. But after your course, I started looking into his story. It didn't add up. I didn't send the second transfer." She smiled almost shyly. "You saved me, and maybe you saved him too." I hugged her gently, because that was the truth of it. Sometimes the most radical thing we can do for someone is not to save them, but to stop enabling the version of them that destroys us. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since court. Not a call, not a letter, not a forwarded meme or a midnight apology. But one day I received a package. No return address, no note. Inside, a photo. Daniel, maybe 9 years old, beaming beside a snowman we had built together in our old backyard. His scarf crooked, his gloves too big, my handwriting on the back. Daniel's first snowman, 1993. For a moment my breath caught. Was it a gesture of peace? Guilt? Manipulation? I didn't know. But I placed the photo in a drawer, not to forget and not to forgive. To remember who he had once been, and to remind myself why I fought so hard not to lose myself when he did. That night, I finally lit the candle, the one I never used on my 72nd birthday. No cake, no ceremony, just a quiet flame on the kitchen counter. I watched it flicker and thought, this is what healing looks like. Not grand, not sudden, but steady, honest, bright enough to warm the room. In the weeks that followed, I began writing again. Not ledgers, not lists, stories. I published an essay on a digital safety site about financial betrayal within families. I titled it, Love is not a contract and trust is not a blank check. It went viral. Emails poured in, invitations, interviews, even a small publisher asking if I'd consider writing a book. I laughed. Me, Meredith Blake, author. But maybe that's what the world needed more of, stories told by the quiet ones. The ones who don't scream, who don't retaliate in kind, who simply outlast the storm with calm, relentless truth. One afternoon, I walked past the old coffee shop I used to take Daniel to when he was little. I stopped outside. Inside, a mother sat with her son. He was maybe 10, laughing, spilling whipped cream on his sweater. The mother looked tired, but she looked happy. I stood there for a while just watching. Then I turned and walked home, my heart quiet. Because I knew something now. Love doesn't make us weak, but silence. Silence in the face of harm that does. And I had unlearned that silence. I had reclaimed my voice. And in doing so, I became something no scam, no game, no betrayal could ever undo. I became whole again. It was almost a year to the day when I received the official notice. First repayment installment received. $1,200 from Daniel Blake. A sterile email. No emotion. No apology. Just the beginning of something slow and legal. And yet I stared at that message for a long time. Not because of the amount, it was a fraction of what was taken, but because it meant that somewhere out there my son had signed a check. With his name, to me. Was it guilt? Obligation? Court-mandated compliance? I didn't know. I didn't care. Because finally he had put something back. Even if it wasn't remorse. Even if it was just paper. That same day, I had a speaking engagement at a retirement community across town. A new request they'd seen the Justice Stream clip read my essay and wanted a strong voice to educate their residents on financial safety. The director, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense haircut, shook my hand firmly. "We want you to scare them," she said, only half joking. "I don't scare," I smiled. "I teach." She walked me through the space. Bright, well-kept, cheerful. But the faces of the residents told a different story. Tired. Cautious. Some embarrassed. Some angry. Some resigned. I recognized it instantly. That quiet shame that settles into the soul after betrayal. I told them what I wish someone had told me. That manipulation doesn't always sound like a scam. It often sounds like love. That temporary help can become permanent loss. That no is a complete sentence. That trust must have receipts. And that even if the person betraying you is your own child, your worth does not vanish with their disrespect. There was a long silence after I spoke. Then slowly one woman stood. "My grandson is asking for my bank login," she said, voice shaking. "He says it's for his college loan." I wanted to help. But now, her eyes welled up. "You don't owe him your future," I said gently. "Help isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in whether they still look you in the eye after they take it." Afterward, several residents came to speak with me privately. A retired teacher who had lost $30,000 to a fake investment club her son invited her into. A widower whose daughter emptied his pension for rent and never paid him back. A woman who hadn't told anyone, not even her best friend, about the nephew who convinced her to mortgage her house. I listened. I nodded. And I repeated the same thing over and over like a mantra they'd forgotten. "You're not stupid. You're not weak. You were kind." And someone chose to twist that into an opportunity. I got home late that evening. The porch light had clicked on automatically, casting a warm glow over the front steps. My cat waited by the door, tail curled like punctuation on a quiet sentence. Inside, the answering machine blinked once. One message. I pressed play. It wasn't Daniel. It was a woman named Sharon from a radio station in Vermont. She wanted to feature my story on a live segment about elder fraud and digital dangers. I smiled, bemused. I was becoming a voice for something I'd never imagined would define my 70s. But maybe this was what purpose felt like. Not grand gestures, not applause. Just being useful again. That night, I sat by the window and opened a new journal. Not the old ledger, not the file of pain. This was something new. At the top of the first page, I wrote, Chapter 2, The Year I Stopped Being Afraid. Then below that, in smaller script, love doesn't always mean access. Trust doesn't always mean surrender, and silence doesn't always mean survival. I thought of Daniel somewhere out there, maybe still gaming, maybe still angry, maybe starting to understand, or maybe not. But it didn't matter anymore, because I had found something better than forgiveness. I had found forward motion, and as I turned the page, I realized there are still many more chapters to write, and none of them belong to him. The invitations didn't stop. After the radio interview aired, a trickle of interest became a flood. Podcasts, community bulletins, local news stations, even a university ethics course reached out asking if I would speak to students about intergenerational trust and financial autonomy. I didn't even know what half those terms meant at first, but I knew what betrayal felt like, and I knew what it took to crawl back from it. So I said yes, again and again. One afternoon, while preparing slides for a workshop, I received an email from a woman named Laura. Her message was brief, almost hesitant. "Hi, Meredith. I'm Daniel's ex-girlfriend. We broke up last year. I saw your video and I want you to know, you were never crazy. He did things to me too. Emotionally, financially. I just didn't have the strength to expose it like you did. But you gave me courage. Thank you, Lara." I read it twice, then a third time, and suddenly I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Grief. Not for myself, but for the woman I used to be. The woman who made excuses, who waited for apologies, who stayed quiet in the name of family. And for Lara, Lara still wondering if it's safe to speak. I replied, "Dear Lara, I'm so sorry you went through that. You're not alone. And your silence until now was never weakness. It was survival. Speaking up isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming the space someone else tried to steal. Keep reclaiming, Meredith." I started noticing little shifts in myself. I walked straighter. I stopped apologizing for speaking too long during panels. I looked people in the eye when I said, "My son betrayed me." Not with shame, but with clarity. It was no longer a confession. It was a fact. A stone on which I had built something new. One evening, while grocery shopping, I ran into an old friend, Margaret, from the library board I used to serve on. She hadn't seen the video, hadn't read the articles. She was still living in that before world where I was just Meredith, who made good casseroles and always returned her books on time. When I told her what happened, everything her eyes widened. "Oh, Meredith," she said, "you should have told me." I smiled. I didn't know how. Back then, she squeezed my hand. Well, now the whole world knows. And they're better for it. Better. That word stuck with me. Not fixed, not restored, just better. I didn't want my old life back. Not really. It was too full of silence and soft betrayals I didn't know how to name. But this new life, this version of me, I was older, wiser, a little lonelier perhaps, but more whole than I had ever been. I took a weekend trip by myself, my first solo vacation. Just me, a bed and breakfast near the coast, and the sound of waves that didn't care about my past. I brought a notebook. On the first page I wrote, "Things I deserve without asking. Respect, peace, financial independence, to say no without guilt, to be listened to be believed, to rest, to laugh again, to stop explaining myself, to tell my story." One evening, walking along the shore, I saw a boy maybe 16 playing a game on his phone. His mother sat nearby, scrolling through something with furrowed brows. I watched them for a moment, and I hoped quietly that he would grow into a man who asked what his mother needed before asking what she could give. I hoped she'd know to say no. I hoped neither of them would become a story like mine. But if they did, I'd be waiting. With my voice, with my pages, with the truth. Because truth once spoken is never really silent again. The publisher called on a Thursday. "Meredith," the woman said, in a voice as smooth as polished stone, "we'd like to move forward with your book." I stared at the phone, dumbfounded. "A book," I echoed. "Yes. Your essays, the lectures, the transcripts from the workshops, it's all so powerful. We think there's a larger story here, something that could really make waves." I sat down slowly at the dining table, the same one where Daniel had once asked for help with his geometry homework. The same place where he asked for money again and again. Now the same place where I'd write the truth. The working title was simple: The Ledger, How I Reclaimed My Life After My Son Stole It. They loved it. So did I. It was perfect. Because that old notebook, the one with the handwritten records, the transfers, the betrayal had been both my undoing and my salvation. And now it was a manuscript. I started writing in the mornings. Just 2 hours a day, sometimes less. I wrote in plain language, not trying to sound clever or academic, just real. Chapter 1. A Birthday and a Bank Statement. Chapter 2. The Digital Disappearance of $74,000. Chapter 3. Silence Wears a Familiar Face. Chapter 4. The Forum Where He Laughed. Chapter 5. Crypto Candles and Closure. Each chapter peeled back another layer of the old me. And in doing so, I gave shape to someone new. People began sending me their stories. A man in Texas whose niece forged his signature to buy NFTs. A grandmother in Oregon whose grandson took her identity and wrecked her credit. A quiet woman in Ohio who whispered over the phone, "He said I was crazy when I asked for a receipt." They weren't crazy. They were survivors. And every one of them became a footnote in my book. A mosaic of pain turned into strength. Daniel didn't reach out again. Not even when news of the book deal surfaced online. I thought maybe he'd show up at my door again. Maybe try to block publication. Maybe send a guilt-soaked message about airing family business. But there was only silence. And I'd learned not to fear that anymore. The day I finished the manuscript, I took myself out for breakfast. Just me and a booth by the window at May's Diner, the one with chipped blue booths and a server who always calls me darlin'. I ordered French toast and black coffee. I brought the final pages with me. And as I read the last line, "This is the story of how I stopped apologizing for surviving," I let myself cry, not because I was sad, because I was free. 3 weeks later, the publisher sent a cover draft, a simple image, an open ledger book, pages turning in the wind, with a single candle burning beside it. Underneath my name, I laughed when I saw it. Not out of disbelief, but out of recognition. I knew that woman. I had built her from scratch. I donated my old ledger to Silver Shield's headquarters. They framed it. It now hangs beside their wall of resilience with a small placard beneath that reads, "Every number has a name. Every page tells a truth. Don't let your silence become someone else's currency." People take photos with it now. That little brown book with my shaky cursive and red inked circles had become a symbol, not of loss, but of reclamation. Late one night, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. No subject, no greeting, just one line. "You really did turn it into something, didn't you?" No name. But I knew who it was. I didn't reply, because I didn't need to, because the answer was already out there, in every page, in every voice I had helped rise from the dust. In the ledger now closed, the book launched quietly. No billboards, no fancy press tours, just a modest release with an independent press, a small write-up in a Sunday column, and a handful of interviews I did over Zoom from my study, where the shelves behind me still held old ledgers, cat figurines, and a jar of peppermint candies. But the quiet didn't last. It started with a single reader review that went viral. My mom read this in one sitting. Then she called me crying, not because I'd ever stolen from her, but because she finally realized she could say no. That's the power of this book. Then came the blog posts. Then came the influencers. Then came the headlines. The mother who took on online exploitation and won. Meredith Blake's The Ledger is a manifesto for the silent generation. A 72-year-old retiree just became the most important voice in digital accountability. It was surreal. For most of my life, I had been the quiet one, the behind-the-scenes person, the reliable support beam in the lives of others. Now I was the center of something, and it didn't feel like spotlight. It felt like purpose. One afternoon, a producer from a well-known morning show called. "Would you fly to New York?" she asked. "We'd love to have you on the segment. Talk about financial betrayal. Show the world that strength doesn't come with youth. It comes with clarity." I hesitated. New York. Planes. Lights. Clarissa encouraged me. "You're not just Meredith anymore," she said. "You're every woman who gave too much. Time to stand up for her." So I said yes. I wore my dove gray sweater, the one with the pearl buttons, hair swept up, a touch of lipstick. Not for vanity, but for visibility. When I walked onto that stage, I felt every heartbeat of the women who'd emailed me. The ones who'd cried over coffee, over bills, over sons who didn't call unless they needed something. The host smiled warm and polished. "You're a national icon now, Meredith. How does it feel?" I looked straight into the camera. "I'm not an icon," I said. "I'm a warning." That evening, Daniel emailed me. I hadn't heard from him in months, not since the silent message about the photo. The subject line read, "I saw the segment. I opened it. Inside. I never thought you'd actually do it. I guess. You really did become someone." That was it. No apology, no denial. Just a faint trace of recognition. And for the first time, I didn't cry after reading something from him. I felt light. Because I had in fact become someone, not because I exposed him, but because I refused to disappear after being broken. I used a portion of my book advance to fund a new initiative through Silver Shieldy, the Digital Dignity Project, a national campaign to educate older adults on financial boundaries, online awareness, and intergenerational empowerment. We hosted workshops, created online resources, distributed printed guides to community centers and libraries, and most importantly, we gave people a place to tell their stories. Because stories I'd learned are how we reclaim ourselves. At one of our gatherings, an elderly man named Thomas stood up, voice shaking. "My son said I was too old to manage my own money, so he took over my finances. I thought it was normal, helpful, but then I read Meredith's book." He paused, eyes glassy. And I realized, help doesn't feel like suffocation. Help listens. Help explains. What my son did, that wasn't help. The room was quiet. Then, applause. Not for me, for him, because he had found his voice. That night, back in my little house with its creaky floors and soft lamplight, I made tea. My cat curled at my feet. I opened my new ledger, not the one for finances, but the one for moments. I wrote, "Today, someone spoke the truth for the first time in years, and I got to hear it." I closed the book smiling, and I thought, Daniel was once my legacy, but now I've rewritten it. Page by page, the speaking invitations began to shift. They were no longer just community centers and local news panels. Now universities called policy groups, financial ethics committees, even lawmakers. They didn't just want the story. They wanted the solution. How do we stop this? One senator's aide asked during a virtual town hall. What legislation could have protected you? I answered honestly. Protection starts before the policy. It starts with education, conversation, and accountability within families. They blinked, taken aback. But I wasn't there to flatter anyone. I was there to tell the truth. The kind most people keep buried under politeness and shame. Later that week, I was invited to join a task force on elder financial exploitation. The chairperson was a sharp woman in her 50s named Renee. After the first meeting, she pulled me aside. "You're the only one on this panel who's actually lived it," she said. "You speak with a calm that shakes people. We need that." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Calm that shakes. I had never thought of myself that way before. But maybe she was right. Maybe silence isn't always weakness. Maybe sometimes it's the weight of truth being held with dignity. That night, I went home and pulled out a letter I hadn't touched in over a year. Daniel's last check, the first $1,200. I had never cashed it. Not out of pride, but because it felt like blood money, guilt money, a band-aid on a hemorrhage. I held it in my hands, ran my fingers along the faded ink, then finally quietly shredded it. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed it to feel whole. Weeks passed. The book kept selling. The foundation kept growing. And I kept receiving letters. One from a high school senior named Maya who wrote, "I read your story to my grandmother." She cried. Then she took back control of her bank account from my uncle. "You gave her permission to believe her instincts. Thank you." Another from a social worker in Louisiana. "We use your book in training now, not because it's sad, but because it's real. You made the invisible visible." And one from a mother who had been on the other side. "My son tried to guilt me into funding his crypto startup. I almost said yes, but then I remembered your line. Help doesn't feel like fear. I said no. He's angry. But I'm sleeping better. I read them all. Saved every one. Taped some to the wall beside my desk as reminders. Because when the nights are quiet and the doubts return, they anchor me. Then one day I received a message I never expected. It was from Daniel's high school friend Robbie. We hadn't spoken in decades. His email was brief. Meredith, I don't know if this matters to you, but I wanted to say, I knew who he was becoming. I didn't stop him. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of it. What you've built is incredible. I hope you know that. I sat with that for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it was honest. And after everything, honesty still felt rare enough to honor. That weekend, I planted bulbs in the backyard. Daffodils, tulips, hyacinths, flowers that took time to bloom. I dug each hole slowly. My knees ached. My back complained. But I kept going, because I wasn't just planting flowers. I was planting the future. One that wouldn't need me to water it forever. One that would bloom long after I was gone. That's what healing had taught me. You don't need closure to grow. You just need good soil and the courage to try again. And I had both. Later, I wrote a new entry in my journal. I am not just a woman who was stolen from. I am the woman who built something afterward. He took the money. I kept the meaning. Autumn deepened. My garden turned into a quiet orchestra of reds, golds, and crumbling leaves, each one falling without ceremony, without apology. I found myself watching the trees more than usual. There's a strange dignity in shedding, not in what is lost, but in what is let go. And I had begun to let go of many things. The idea of reconciliation, the idea that my son would one day call and truly say, I'm sorry. The fantasy of returning to some past version of our family, unfractured and intact. I no longer needed those things to feel whole. One afternoon, I was asked to appear in a documentary. The producer, a soft-spoken woman named Aaliyah, was creating a series about digital betrayal. Stories from the edges of the internet, real stories, raw and unsensationalized. We're not looking for drama, she told me. We're looking for depth. You've lived that. I agreed. We filmed over the course of 3 days in my home. She interviewed me in the living room, the garden, the tiny study where my ledger still sat in its place of quiet honor. I told her everything again. But this time I didn't cry. Not once. In the final scene, she asked, if Daniel knocked on your door tomorrow, what would you say? I thought for a long time. Then I answered, I'd say, I don't hate you, but I no longer make space for people who confuse love with access. See? So, she nodded slowly, camera still rolling. That's a powerful line, she said. It's not a line, I replied. It's a boundary. The documentary aired on a Sunday. Small release. Niche platform, but something about it touched people in a different way. Maybe it was the lack of sensational music. Maybe it was the stillness of it. The slow camera pans the silence between sentences. Or maybe people were just ready to hear someone say, you can love someone, and still walk away to save yourself. My inbox filled again. But this time, so did my mailbox. Letters. Handwritten. Dozens of them. Some in neat cursive. Others barely legible through shaky ink. Most started the same way. I've never told anyone this before. One woman, Evelyn from Boise, wrote, my son drained my checking account 5 years ago. I never spoke of it. My friends think he's a tech genius. But I saw your documentary and I finally cried. Thank you for letting me feel again. Another from Joseph in Brooklyn. I always thought being a man meant staying silent. Your story reminded me that dignity is genderless. I saved every letter, placed them in a box labeled Voices I Believe In, because believing in others when they've forgotten how to believe in themselves is the most radical form of restoration I've ever known. Winter crept in with quiet feet. One morning, I stood by the window with a cup of tea and watched the first snow fall. Soft, gentle, forgiving. And I thought, this is what the world feels like when you're not surviving it anymore, just living in it again. I opened a new page in my journal. Things I gained after the fall. A voice that echoes. A ledger of healing. Letters from strangers. Peace at my own kitchen table. A new name for love. Boundaries. Purpose. And still strangely, hope. Then I received an email that made me pause. The subject line read, Daniel Blake, request for interview. It wasn't from him. It was from a reporter working on a follow-up piece to my book and documentary. He wanted to complete the arc by interviewing Daniel. He's agreed, the message read. He wants to share his side. My stomach didn't twist. It just stilled. Like the final note of a song you've heard enough times to stop crying through. I didn't reply, not out of anger, but because the story was no longer his to complete. It was mine. And it was already whole. The snow didn't stop for days. Each morning I'd wake to find the world outside, coated in a fresh, quiet white, as if nature itself had chosen to repaint everything I once knew. I spent those days inside tending to slow things, journaling, rewriting the workshop guides with clearer, kinder language, reading the letters from strangers who somewhere in the hush of their own lives had whispered truths they'd buried for years. I made soups, lit candles, learned to bake bread badly. It felt holy in its own quiet way, a kind of domestic healing, a place where nothing had to be perfect to be enough. Then came the letter from Daniel, a real letter, handwritten, no return address, just my name and house number in neat, unfamiliar script, as if he couldn't bring himself to write the full truth of our connection. I held it for hours before opening it. Finally, with hands steadier than I expected, I read, "Mom, I saw the film. I read some of the articles. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I wouldn't blame you. I don't know what to say except, I'm starting to understand. You weren't just angry. You were right. I've started counseling. I've stopped gaming. I deleted the forums. I won't ask for forgiveness. I just wanted to tell you, you were the last person who ever gave a damn. I'm sorry I broke that. Danielle." I read it once, twice, then placed it in a drawer with the rest of the unopened letters he'd sent in the past, the ones I never had the heart to destroy. Not because I wanted them, but because they were proof of a story I had lived. I didn't write him back. Not because I hadn't forgiven him, but because forgiveness for me no longer needed a door left open. Forgiveness was a room I built for myself, where he no longer had a key. That week, a college student named Andrea came to visit. She was writing her senior thesis on intergenerational financial trauma, and her professor had suggested my book. She sat in my living room recorder in hand, eyes wide. "Do you ever regret going public?" she asked. I paused. "No," I said. "But I regret waiting so long to stop making myself small for the sake of love." She nodded slowly. "That's the part people don't understand, I think. That it's not about revenge, it's about dignity." I smiled. "Exactly." Andrea asked if she could quote one last line from my book in her paper. The one that read, "My silence didn't protect my son. It only delayed my own survival." She called it the thesis of my life. Maybe it is. In early spring, I was asked to speak at the state capitol for Elder Abuse Awareness Week. They gave me 10 minutes. I only needed 6. I spoke not of theft, but of thresholds. Of the moment we stop pretending love makes us safe. Of the moment we realize that the hardest goodbyes aren't between people but between versions of ourselves we finally outgrow. When I finished, no one clapped right away. They just sat, still, changed. Then the applause came. Soft at first, then rising. Not because I had said something clever, but because I had told the truth out loud. And truth has a sound. That night, I lit another candle. Not for grief, not for Daniel, but for every woman who sat with her hands trembling over a transfer button telling herself this is what love requires. I whispered into the flame, "It doesn't." And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years. Lightness. Not freedom from the past, but peace with it. The kind you don't announce. You just carry it with you, quiet and strong, like a ledger balanced, like a soul returned. I turned 73 surrounded by strangers. Not strangers in the empty sense, but people I hadn't known a year ago. People who now knew me more deeply than some I'd called family. There was a small gathering at the library. Silver Shield had organized it, just a table of tea cookies and a modest banner that read, 1 year of the ledger. I wore the same pale gray sweater I'd filmed the documentary in, the same one I wore in the courtroom and the day I deleted Daniel's contact for good. It had become a sort of armor now, but soft. Clarissa gave a small toast. She said Meredith didn't just write a story. She handed us a mirror. And for those of us who've been silent too long, she handed us a microphone. There were tears, then laughter. Then an older gentleman named Martin stood up. "I thought I was alone," he said. "My daughter took everything after my stroke. I didn't think I had the right to fight back. Then I read her book." He turned to me, voice catching. "You gave me permission to take my name off the checkbook and put it back on the deed." The room went quiet. I nodded once, trying not to cry. After the event, I walked home in the cool evening air. No fanfare, no reporters, no social media tags. Just my steps, my breath, my shadow moving forward. I passed the bench at the corner near my house, the one Daniel and I used to sit on after his appointments when he was little. He'd always ask for 2 quarters to get a soda. Back then I gave without thinking. Now I give with awareness. And that's not bitterness. That's maturity. That night I opened my newest journal, volume 4, of what I now called the Reclamation Chronicles. I wrote, "One year ago I was staring at an empty bank account and an unopened birthday cake. Today I have balance not in the ledger but in my life." Then for the first time I added a line not about Daniel or justice or silence. I wrote about joy. "The tulips are coming in early. They didn't ask for permission. They just grew." The next morning I made coffee, fed the cat, and checked the mail. Among the bills and flyers there was a small package. No return address. Inside, a tiny hand-carved wooden bird. Simple, smooth. No note. No name. Just a symbol, maybe? An apology without words. Or perhaps just an ending. I held it for a while, then placed it on the windowsill beside the photo of me in the garden. Not as a wound reopened, but as a memory. Closed but acknowledged. Like the final page of a book you don't regret reading, but wouldn't choose to read again. Later that day, I recorded a video for the Silver Shield archives. Just a message. A farewell to the first year of the project. At the end, I looked into the camera and said, "If your story has been stolen, your voice, your savings, your sense of safety, this is your reminder. You're not crazy. You're not alone. And you are allowed to draw a line where love becomes harm. You are not selfish for surviving. You are wise." I clicked stop and smiled because I finally believed it. They call it closure, but I don't think that's quite right. What I have now isn't a sealed vault or a final chapter. It's not justice wrapped in a bow or a neat ending for others to applaud. What I have is space. Space between me and the pain. Between who I was and who I've become. I still miss him sometimes. Not Daniel now, but the boy he used to be. The one with paint on his hands and questions in his eyes. The one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder believing I could fix anything. But I no longer carry that version of him like a weight. I carry her instead. The woman who stared into an empty bank account and chose not to disappear. The woman who picked up a pen and instead of writing checks wrote her truth. The woman who found that healing doesn't come from being heard by the one who hurt you. It comes from hearing yourself again. So if you're reading this or listening, if you're in the middle of your own unraveling, let me offer this. You're allowed to protect yourself. You're allowed to rebuild without asking permission. And you're allowed to outgrow the silence. One page, one word, one boundary at a time. This is not a story about theft. It's a story about reclamation. And that story is still being written.